What if the worst thing a president can do to your economy is nothing at all? No bombs, no missiles, no headline explosion, just silence. And that silence is now strangling a nation of 90 million people. Before we go any further, hit that like button right now, because this story is not really about Iran. It is about how power actually works in the modern world. And once you understand it, you will start noticing it. Everywhere. Subscribe if you have not already, tap the bell so you do not miss the next one, and share this with one person who still thinks war only means bombs falling from the sky. Now let's get into it. For months, the entire world watched the skies over Kharg Island, waiting for fire. Kharg is a tiny coral island sitting quietly in the Persian Gulf, barely 5 miles long, 15 miles off Iran's coast. It looks like nothing on a map, a speck, a dot. Most people could not find if you gave them an hour in a globe, but that tiny dot carries almost everything Iran has. Around 90% of Iran's crude oil exports move through its terminals. If you wanted to choke an entire economy with one single strike, this is the exact place you would hit. Donald Trump knew it. He said it out loud, more than once in the way only he says things. He called Kharg Island Iran's crown jewel. He threatened to obliterate it completely. He threatened to seize it outright. The same way, he said, the United States had already taken control of Venezuela's oil markets after removing that country's leader. Earlier in the year, he posted on social media that soon he would control Iran's entire oil and gas trade, the same way he controlled Venezuela's. Analysts across the world braced for a knockout blow. Reporters camped on the story for days, waiting for satellite images of burning tankers, shattered docks, and columns of black smoke rising over the Gulf. Then, in March, the strike finally came. American aircraft hit more than 90 military sites on Kharg Island in a single night. Air defenses, a naval base, mine storage, facilities, radar stations, all flattened in hours. Trump went online almost immediately and called it one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East. He said Iran's military presence on the island had been totally obliterated. For a moment, it looked exactly like the ending everyone expected. Fire, followed by more fire, followed by collapse. But here's the strange part, the part that confused analysts at the time. He stopped there. He did not touch the oil terminals. Not one storage tank, not one loading dock, not one pipeline. He said, in his own words, that he was choosing not to destroy the oil infrastructure for reasons of decency. He even warned Iran that he could reconsider that decision at any moment if the country kept attacking ships in the Strait of Hormuz. But for now, on paper at least, the oil kept flowing. The tankers kept loading. Iran breathed a small, cautious sigh of relief. If you were only half paying attention that week, you probably assumed the Kharg Island story was over. A big, scary threat, a limited strike, restraint at the last moment, a dramatic headline. Then silence. Case closed. Iran survives to fight another day. That is the story most news coverage left you with. A cliffhanger that never got a real resolution. Except that is exactly the story Trump wanted people to believe. Because while the entire world stared at the sky, waiting for bombs that never fell on the oil terminals, something else was happening beneath the surface. Something slower, something far quieter. And in the end, something that would hurt Iran more than any airstrike on those tanks ever could. To understand what actually happened here, you first need to understand what oil truly means to a country like Iran. This is not just about funding weapons or paying generals. Oil is the blood running through the entire Iranian state. Close to half of the government's total revenue comes from oil and gas sales. That money pays soldiers. It pays police. It funds the subsidies that keep bread, fuel, and basic goods affordable for millions of ordinary families who have nothing to do with any war. It funds the entire machinery that keeps the regime standing upright. Take that money away, slowly, quietly, month after month, and you're not just damaging an economy anymore. You are hollowing out a government from the inside, one empty terminal at a time. There's also history here worth remembering, because Kharg Island has been a target before. Back in the 1980s, during the brutal Iran-Iraq War, Iraqi forces repeatedly bombed Kharg Island to try to strangle Iran's oil revenue and its ability to fund the fight. It worked for a while, but it also united Iranians in defiance, because bombs create martyrs, and martyrs create resolve. Trump seemed to understand that lesson from history far better than people gave him credit for. Bombing the terminals in 2026 would have been dramatic television. It would have dominated headlines for a week straight. But burning oil tanks does something else too. It sends global oil prices spiking overnight. It pushes gas prices higher at pumps from Ohio to Manchester. Voters feel that kind of pain immediately, standing at the fuel station, watching the numbers climb, and they remember exactly who was president when it happened. So instead of destroying the pipeline that carries Iran's oil to the entire world, Trump chose a different weapon. He chose to strangle the pipeline itself, quietly, without spending a single extra missile. Here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, so stay with me. Because this is the part almost nobody explained clearly in the mainstream coverage. The United States Navy moved into position along Iran's coastline and effectively sealed it off, not with bombs, with ships, with radar, with sheer, patient naval presence sitting silently in international waters. A blockade, in every practical sense of the word, even if nobody in Washington wanted to use that exact term out loud. Tankers trying to leave Kharg Island suddenly found themselves stuck in place, waiting, watching their empty cargo hold sit idle while the country behind them grew more desperate with every passing week. Shipping analysts started tracking the numbers, and those numbers told a genuinely brutal story. One of Kharg's main terminals went 22 consecutive days without loading a single tanker. Another terminal, the one built specifically for liquid petroleum gas, sat completely idle for 13 straight days. A third terminal recorded no loadings for 10 days running. There were no departures at all from the island for extended stretches. Meanwhile, more than a dozen tankers sat anchored nearby in open water, engines idling, going absolutely nowhere. Some of them even switched off their position tracking signals entirely, as if hiding from a storm that never appeared on any radar because the storm was invisible. It was economic, not meteorological, and it was far more dangerous. Think carefully about what that actually means for a country that depends on oil money simply to function day to day. Imagine your entire household income depends on one delivery truck reaching the market every single morning. Now imagine that truck sits parked in the warehouse for 3 straight weeks, unable to move, engine cold. No, deliveries arrive, no income comes in, but the bills still land in your mailbox on schedule. Workers still show up expecting to be paid on time. That is roughly what happened to Iran, except multiply that single household by an entire nation of 90 million people, and multiply the stakes by billions of dollars a month. Before all of this tightened, most of Iran's oil was still finding buyers somewhere in the world, mainly refineries across China, even in the middle of an active war. Trade routes bent. Around sanctions, prices dropped to attract nervous buyers, but the money kept trickling in, just enough to keep the lights on. That trickle is what kept the government functioning day to day. Once the naval blockade tightened its grip fully, the trickle slowed to almost nothing at all. Iranian state media, usually loud and defiant, suddenly went unusually quiet on the subject of exports. Instead of proudly announcing shipment numbers, officials started talking about resilience and crisis management, which, if you have followed enough conflicts, is usually the exact language governments reach for when they are quietly losing and refuse to say so out loud. This is the exact moment where the real story finally reveals itself. Trump did not need to blow up Kharg Island to break it. He simply needed to make sure nothing meaningful could leave it. Now, quick pause, because I want you to actually do something before we go any further. If this video is opening your eyes to how modern power really works behind the headlines, do something different this time, instead of just scrolling past. Comment one single word describing how this makes you feel about global politics right now. Curious, nervous, fascinated, uneasy? Type it below this video. I genuinely read these comments, and they shape exactly what story we dig into next on this channel. And if you are new here, subscribe now, because this channel exists to break down precisely this kind of hidden strategy, the moves that never make front-page headlines but quietly reshape entire nations while everyone else is watching the wrong thing. So why exactly is a blockade actually worse than a bombing raid? Now let's break this down properly, piece by piece, because the difference matters far more than most people realize at first glance. A bombing raid is a single violent event. It is shocking. It dominates the news cycle for days, but it ends. Once the smoke finally clears, engineers can start rebuilding almost immediately. Insurance companies calculate the damage and issue payouts. International sympathy sometimes even shifts toward the country that got hit, especially if civilians were harmed in the process. A bombing raid gives the attacked nation something concrete to rally around. It hands them a story of victimhood they can use to unite their own people and justify further sacrifice in the months ahead. A blockade works completely differently. A blockade has no single defining moment. There is no headline explosion for people to point to and rally around. There is only an economy slowly running out of oxygen, week after week, month after month, with no dramatic footage to broadcast on the evening news. No single day anyone can point to and say, that was the attack. Just empty terminals, quiet ports, government officials trying to explain rising prices to angry citizens without ever admitting the real underlying reason. And here is the part that makes this strategy even more devastating when you really sit with it. A blockade does not damage the physical infrastructure at all. Trump did not need to spend a single additional missile after that first bombing night. The oil terminals on Kharg Island still stand exactly where they always stood, fully intact, fully functional, ready to load tankers again the very second ships are allowed to sail freely once more. Which means, and this is the truly cold part of the entire strategy, the leverage never actually disappears. Think about it this way. carefully. If you destroy the infrastructure completely, your bargaining power ends the exact moment the last missile lands on target. There is nothing left standing to threaten. But if you simply choke the flow while leaving the physical pipes and tanks completely untouched, you hold that leverage indefinitely, for as long as you want to hold it. Every single day, Iran wakes up knowing its main economic lifeline is still standing, still perfectly capable of pumping billions of dollars into the national treasury, but permission to actually use it depends entirely on decisions made thousands of miles away in rooms Iran has zero access to. That is not destruction. That is control. Total, ongoing, absolute control, exercised without firing a single extra shot after the first night. Remember that comment Trump made comparing this to Venezuela? He was not exaggerating for dramatic effect, and this is where the story becomes even bigger than most people realize. After the United States removed Venezuela's former leader in a military operation earlier that same year, American authorities effectively took charge of how Venezuela's oil revenue was collected and distributed, with the proceeds funneled directly into accounts controlled by the U.S. Treasury Department. Trump openly said Iran could eventually face that exact same arrangement, not bombed into rubble and ash, managed, supervised, owned in every single way that actually matters, without a single tank ever rolling across a border or a single soldier setting foot on Iranian soil. That is the real threat hiding behind the phrase, "We will be taking Kharg Island." It was never really about ground troops storming a beach in some dramatic invasion. It was always about ownership, about who ultimately decides whether Iran's single most valuable asset on Earth even gets to function at all. There's another layer to this story that rarely gets mentioned, and it involves Israel. Throughout this entire conflict, Israeli officials pushed hard for a much harsher approach toward Kharg Island. At one point, a senior Israeli leader publicly argued that Israel needed to destroy every part of Iran's oil fields and energy industry on that island, insisting that only total destruction could truly cripple the regime and force real change. Trump heard that argument, and he chose a different path entirely. He let the world believe restraint had won the day, while quietly building a mechanism that could squeeze Iran for years, not just for one dramatic news cycle. In some ways, this made both sides happy without either side getting exactly what they originally wanted. Israel got a weakened Iran without a wider humanitarian catastrophe splashed across every front page. Trump got to look measured and responsible on camera while still achieving nearly the same economic outcome behind the scenes. The Strait of Hormuz matters here too, and it deserves its own moment of attention. This narrow stretch of water sits right next to Kharg Island, and it happens to be one of the most important shipping corridors on the entire planet. A huge share of the world's oil physically passes through that strait every single day. Iran has used the threat of closing it or attacking tankers moving through it as one of its few remaining points of leverage in this entire standoff. But leverage works both ways. The same narrow geography that lets Iran threaten global oil supply also makes it incredibly easy for the American Navy to watch, track, and control exactly what leaves the region. The very location that once made Iran feel powerful became the exact choke point used to weaken it. Now let's talk about what this actually did to ordinary people living inside Iran, because numbers on a shipping analyst's report do not fully capture the human weight sitting behind them. When oil exports collapse, government revenue collapses right alongside it. When revenue collapses that severely, a government is left with only a handful of painful choices. Print more money and watch inflation spiral completely out of control. Cut subsidies and watch prices for bread, fuel, and basic goods skyrocket overnight for families already struggling. Or borrow heavily from allies and become even more dependent on outside support just to stay afloat. Iran, under the pressure of this blockade, has been forced to lean on all three options at once, simultaneously, which is exactly the kind of pressure no economy can sustain for long without cracking somewhere. Trump himself, speaking to reporters, pointed directly at this exact outcome without much hesitation. He described watching Iran struggle with runaway inflation and a government slowly running out of money, and he said it almost like he was casually reading numbers off a scoreboard. Cold, detached, almost amused, like a man calmly watching a slow chess match he already knows, deep down, that he has already won. This is what makes the entire situation feel almost cinematic in its quiet coldness. There is no fire to photograph for the front page, no smoke rising dramatically over a skyline for cameras to capture. Just a currency slowly losing its value a little more every single week. Just ordinary families quietly noticing that fuel costs more this month, that bread costs more this month, that salaries somehow stretch a little less far than they did just a month before. Slow pain like this is much harder to see from the outside, but it cuts every bit as deep and sometimes far deeper because there is no single visible enemy to point to, no missile streaking across the sky to blame. Just an invisible hand tightening slowly around the throat of an entire nation's economy, day after day, with nobody outside the country really watching closely enough to notice. And here is something most people completely miss about this entire story. Trump himself has flip-flopped publicly more than once on exactly how far he actually wants to take this. At different points, he said seizing Kharg Island outright was not high on the list for him right now. At other moments entirely, he said American forces could take it very easily because Iran had almost no meaningful defenses left worth mentioning after that first strike. He even floated the idea of hitting the island a few more times just for fun, a phrase that sounds almost unsettlingly casual for something that could reshape an entire regional war overnight. That kind of unpredictability is not a weakness sitting inside his strategy. It is the strategy itself. Iran's leadership can never fully relax, not for one single day, because they can never truly be certain which version of Trump they are dealing with on any given morning, the cautious dealmaker willing to talk, or the man openly threatening total obliteration at a moment's notice. This uncertainty itself becomes its own separate weapon, arguably just as powerful as the blockade. A country that never knows exactly what is coming next cannot plan properly for its own future. It cannot fully rebuild public confidence at home. It cannot promise its own citizens genuine stability, because that stability depends entirely on decisions being made thousands of miles away, inside rooms Iran has absolutely no access to and no real influence over. So where does all of this actually leave Iran right now, today, as you are watching this? Squeezed from every direction at once, watching its single most valuable island on the map sit fully intact and completely useless at the exact same time. Full storage tanks sitting untouched, empty shipping lanes stretching for miles, billions of dollars worth of oil, physically present and ready to move, yet financially frozen in place. It is one of the strangest and most modern forms of economic warfare the world has seen in decades, because the weapon here is not destruction at all. The weapon is denial, not, we will take what you have built, but you may keep everything you have built exactly as it is, and it will do you absolutely no good at all without our permission. There is one more detail worth sitting with here because it says something about how differently people can read the exact same event. Trump, at various points, described Iran's remaining defenses on Kharg Island as almost non-existent, telling one interviewer he did not think the island had any real protection left at all. To him, that was proof of total dominance, a green light he could pull whenever he wanted. To Iranian officials, admitting that same weakness publicly was unthinkable, so instead they doubled down on talk of resilience and endurance, projecting strength they no longer fully had. Two governments looking at the exact same empty terminals, telling two completely different stories to two completely different audiences. That gap between the public story and the private reality is exactly where modern power quietly lives and grows. Before we finish this story, one more thing, and I promise you this is genuinely the last one. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about understanding the world beyond the shallow headlines most channels simply repeat without ever explaining the mechanics behind them. So do this one thing for me right now. Screenshot this exact moment of the video and send it to someone who needs to. See how this really works underneath the surface. Not because I am asking for a favor, but because most people watching the news right now still genuinely believe this is simply a story about bombs that happened not to fall. You now understand it is something far bigger than that headline ever suggested. Let's zoom all the way out for a moment, because the Kharg Island situation is not really just about Iran alone. It is a preview of exactly how conflicts will be fought in the years ahead all around the world. The old age of dramatic, headline-grabbing destruction is slowly being replaced by something far quieter, and in many ways, something far more terrifying to live under. Financial chokeholds instead of missiles, naval blockades that never technically fire a single shot in anger, total control of critical infrastructure without ever needing to physically destroy a single brick of it. Wars increasingly fought through spreadsheets, shipping manifests, and tanker positioning data instead of front lines drawn on old-fashioned battle maps. Why should any of this actually matter to you, sitting wherever you are right now, far away from the Persian Gulf and all of this? Because this exact playbook can be applied absolutely anywhere in the world, against almost any nation. Any country that depends heavily on a single resource, a single port, or a single trade route is deeply vulnerable to this same kind of quiet, patient strangulation. Oil today, rare earth minerals tomorrow, critical shipping lanes carrying semiconductors the day after. The nations that understand this fundamental shift early are the ones who will genuinely hold real power throughout the next decade. The ones who fail to understand it in time will eventually find themselves exactly where Iran stands today, standing right next to a fully intact, perfectly functional national asset that has become completely useless, simply because someone else far away controls the permission to use it. Trump did not bomb Kharg Island's oil infrastructure. Let that single fact sink in one more time before we close this out. He looked directly at the single most valuable target in the entire conflict, and instead of destroying it outright, he simply made absolutely sure Iran could never fully use it again without his personal approval. He quietly turned Iran's greatest single strength into its greatest ongoing weakness, without one single explosion ever touching it. That is not restraint, not really, even though he chose that exact word himself. That is a completely different kind of power altogether. The kind that does not need fire to burn a nation down from the inside, only patience, warships, and time. And that, more than any missile ever could achieve on its own, is precisely the kind of power that should genuinely worry the entire world watching from the outside. Because bombs end wars loudly, in bold headlines and breaking news alerts. This kind of pressure ends them in silence long after the cameras have stopped rolling, long after everyone else has already moved on to the next big explosion happening somewhere else on the planet. Iran is learning that painful lesson in real time right now, terminal by terminal, tanker by tanker, empty day after empty day. And the wider world is only just beginning to fully understand what Trump actually did the moment he chose not to pull the trigger on that oil infrastructure. If this video genuinely changed how you see this entire conflict, make absolutely sure you are subscribed, because this is exactly the kind of story we break down carefully here. The hidden moves sitting quietly underneath the headlines everyone else skips past. Like it, share it with someone who needs to see it, and I will see you in the very next one.